When Diane poured her wine onto the girl's head in front of 200 guests, she smiled. This is what happens when trash tries to sit with royalty. But the old man who'd been watching from the corner moved forward. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough to make the entire room hold its breath. You've just assaulted the legal owner of this property, every brick, every painting, every trust fund bearing your name. Security, remove these trespassers from my granddaughter's home. 2 hours earlier, the evening air in Charleston, South Carolina, carried the scent of magnolia blossoms and old money. The Belmont estate stood like a monument to generational wealth, its 40 rooms glowing with warm light as luxury vehicles rolled up the circular driveway. Tonight was the annual Lowcountry Heritage Foundation Gala, where Black elite families gathered to celebrate legacy, power, and the preservation of history. Inside the mansion, crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across marble floors while a live orchestra played soft jazz. Women glided through the ballroom in designer gowns, their jewelry catching the light with every movement. Men in tailored tuxedos discussed business deals and political connections over glasses of aged bourbon. This was a world where everyone belonged, where lineage and bank accounts determined your worth, where the right last name opened every door. 3 blocks away, 19-year-old Aaliyah Monroe stepped off a city bus, clutching a small purse against her chest. She wore a navy dress borrowed from her neighbor, shoes she'd cleaned until they almost looked new, and the weight of every doubt she'd ever carried about herself. Her mother had been dead for 6 months, kidney failure because they couldn't afford the treatment that might have saved her life. Aaliyah had been living in a women's shelter ever since, working double shifts at a diner while studying for her community college entrance exams. But she'd won something, an essay competition, a scholarship opportunity, a chance to sit in a room with people who'd never known what it meant to choose between electricity and groceries. She walked toward the estate, her heart hammering against her ribs, rehearsing the words she'd practiced in front of the shelter bathroom mirror. Thank you for this opportunity. My mother always believed education could change everything. I won't let her down. The security guard at the gate looked at her like she'd arrived at the wrong address. But her name was on the list. Heritage Scholars Program, Aaliyah Monroe. He waved her through with barely concealed skepticism, and she walked up that long driveway alone, watching luxury cars pass her like she was invisible. Inside the ballroom, the wealth hit her like a physical force. Ice sculptures shaped like swans, waiters in white gloves, laughter that sounded effortless, like joy came naturally when you'd never known struggle. Aaliyah found the scholarship coordinator's table near the back and sat down quietly, trying to make herself small, trying not to attract attention. She observed everything, the way these people moved through the world with absolute certainty that they belonged in it, the way they touched expensive things carelessly because they'd always be able to replace them. And then Diane Hartwell entered the room, and the air itself seemed to shift. Diane was 24 years old and stunning in a way that required both genetics and money to achieve. Her burgundy silk gown probably cost more than Aaliyah had earned in the past year. Diamond earrings caught the light as she laughed at something her companion said. A Cartier bracelet circled her wrist like it weighed nothing, though Aaliyah knew it represented someone's entire salary. Diane's hair fell in perfect curls that could only come from the kind of salon where they served champagne during your appointment. She moved through the crowd like royalty, accepting compliments with gracious nods, her confidence so complete it seemed almost weaponized. Beside her walked her grandmother Lenora Hartwell, 68 years old, and draped in pearls that had probably been in the family for generations. Lenora was a legend in Charleston's black elite circles. Her family had built the city's first black-owned bank in 1952, back when such things required courage that bordered on recklessness. The Hartwells owned half the commercial real estate downtown. They sat on every important board, funded every significant charity, and when Lenora Hartwell spoke, people listened like she was delivering scripture. Diane was the golden granddaughter, the Yale graduate, the girl engaged to a senator's son, the future of a dynasty that had survived everything America could throw at it. Aaliyah watched them from across the room and felt the distance between their worlds like a canyon she'd never be able to cross. She stood to get water from a nearby refreshment table, so her movements careful, trying not to draw attention. But in her nervousness, she stepped backward without looking and bumped directly into a waiter carrying a tray. The waiter stumbled, regained his balance, but water from his tray splashed across the floor near Diane's designer shoes. Time seemed to slow down. The music didn't stop, but conversations paused like someone had turned down the volume on the entire room. Diane gasped dramatically and jumped back, staring at the water droplets near her feet like they were acid. She turned, her eyes landing on Aaliyah with the kind of cold precision that suggested she'd been waiting for an excuse to notice her. "Are you serious right now?" Diane said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. Aaliyah's mouth went dry. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see him. I wasn't looking where I was going." Diane looked her up and down slowly, taking in the borrowed dress, the cleaned shoes, the absence of jewelry, the wrongness of everything about this girl's presence in this space. "These shoes cost more than your rent," Diane said. "Who are you?" Aaliyah felt 200 pairs of eyes turning toward her. "I'm Aaliyah Monroe. I'm here for the Heritage Scholars Program, the scholarship recipients." Diane's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "Scholars? You mean the charity cases?" Nearby guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. Aaliyah felt heat crawling up her neck. "I won an essay competition. The foundation invited me." Diane smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "How adorable. And did your essay explain that you don't know how to watch where you're walking?" Lenora Hartwell placed a manicured hand on her granddaughter's shoulder, her touch gentle but her words surgical. "Darling, don't waste your energy." Then she turned to Aaliyah with a smile that looked kind until you saw her eyes. "Sweetheart, I think you're confused about tonight. This table is for Foundation Board members. The scholarship recipients sit in the back." She pointed toward a small table near the kitchen doors, partially hidden behind a decorative column. Aaliyah's face burned. "I didn't know. I'm sorry, I'll move." Diane's voice followed her as she gathered her purse. "That girl will never sit at our table. She doesn't understand how things work here." The walk across that ballroom felt like miles. Whispers followed Aaliyah like a shadow she couldn't escape. She sat down at the small table near the kitchen, fighting tears, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the tablecloth. A waiter approached quietly and set down a glass of water. "Don't let them break you," he whispered before moving away. But across the room, Diane was laughing with her friends, pointing in Aaliyah's direction, and the humiliation felt like it might swallow her whole. What Aaliyah didn't notice was the old man in the far corner, near the French doors that led to the garden. He sat alone in an impeccable black suit, his face weathered but distinguished, his eyes sharp despite his age. He'd been watching everything, the collision, the cruelty, the public shaming. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, with enough force to turn his knuckles pale. But he didn't move. Not yet, because timing, he knew, was everything. And these people, these cruel, careless people, hadn't finished revealing exactly who they were. The foundation director took the microphone 20 minutes later, his voice warm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to announce this year's Heritage Scholar. The winner wrote a beautiful essay about resilience in the face of loss, about honoring the sacrifices our parents make, about choosing hope when the world offers you every reason to surrender. Please join me in welcoming Aaliyah Monroe. The applause was polite but thin, uncomfortable, like people weren't sure if they should celebrate the scholarship girl after what they'd just witnessed. Aaliyah stood on shaking legs and walked toward the small stage, feeling every eye on her, hearing Diane's voice from across the room, stage whispering just loud enough to carry. Sob story scholarship. Of course. Her friends giggled. Lenora didn't stop her. Aaliyah reached the microphone and her hands trembled as she gripped the stand. Thank you to the Heritage Foundation for this incredible opportunity. My mother worked 3 jobs so I could dream bigger than our circumstances. She was a hospice nurse who spent her life caring for people in their final days, giving them dignity when everything else had been stripped away. This scholarship means I get to honor her sacrifice. It means I get to prove that her faith in me wasn't misplaced. Her voice cracked on the last sentence, genuine grief breaking through her carefully constructed composure. Some guests nodded respectfully. A few looked genuinely moved. But Diane slow-clapped from her table, the sound mocking and deliberate, and her grandmother watched with an expression that suggested she found the whole performance distasteful. Aaliyah returned to her table and sat down, her heart still racing. The foundation director approached a moment later, his smile kind. Beautiful words, dear. Your mother would be so proud. It was the first genuine kindness anyone had shown her all night, and Aaliyah felt something loosen in her chest. Maybe she did belong here. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe the cruelty had passed and she could just enjoy this one night of possibility. Dinner was served shortly after, elegant plates of filet mignon and roasted vegetables that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Aaliyah ate slowly, trying to observe proper etiquette, trying to blend in, and then Diane approached her table, a wine glass in her hand, her smile sharp enough to cut. So, Aaliyah, she said, pulling out the chair across from her without invitation, tell me, where exactly did your mother work? Let me guess, cleaning houses? Aaliyah looked up, trying to keep her voice steady. She was a hospice nurse. I said that in my speech. Diane waved her hand dismissively. How noble, caring for dying people. And yet here you are, begging for handouts from people who actually built something. Aaliyah's throat tightened. I'm not begging. I earned this scholarship. Diane's friends had gathered around now, forming a loose circle, their designer dresses creating a wall of silk and judgment. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, said quietly, Diane, maybe leave her alone. Diane turned to her friend with exaggerated innocence. Why? I'm just asking questions. Isn't that what scholarships are for? Learning? She turned back to Aaliyah, her gaze dropping to her shoes. Did your essay mention that you can't even afford shoes that fit properly? Those heels are at least 2 years old and a size too small. I can see it from here. Laughter rippled through Diane's group. Aaliyah's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She tried to stand, to leave, but Diane's voice stopped her. Oh, don't run away now. We're just getting to know you. That's when Lenora Hartwell joined them, her presence commanding immediate silence. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of tone adults use with children they're about to discipline. Diane, sweetheart, don't be cruel. I'm sure Aaliyah is very grateful for this opportunity, aren't you, dear? The question was a trap, demanding public performance of humility, forcing Aaliyah to prostrate herself in front of everyone. Aaliyah's voice came out barely above a whisper. Yes, ma'am, very grateful. Lenora smiled. Good, that's what I thought. Remember that gratitude, sweetheart. People like us, we're the reason people like you get chances at all. The words landed like slaps. People like us, people like you. The distance between those categories insurmountable and absolute. Diane set her wineglass on Aaliyah's table with deliberate precision. You know what? I think you should give a toast to all the generous people who paid for you to be here tonight. To all of us who work hard so that charity cases can pretend to belong. Aaliyah's hands were shaking. I already spoke. I thanked everyone. Diane's smile widened. I insist. Stand up. Give us a proper toast. The ballroom had gone quiet again, that awful attention settling over everything. Guests were watching now, some uncomfortable, some curious, but all of them silent. No one intervened. No one told Diane to stop. No one defended the 19-year-old girl whose mother had died 6 months ago, who was living in a shelter, who had come here tonight believing education might save her. Aaliyah stood because she didn't know what else to do. Diane handed her the wineglass. Go ahead, she said. Toast to your betters. And in the corner, the old man's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. His hands gripped his chair with enough force to leave impressions in the leather. But he still didn't move, because he needed to see this through. He needed to witness exactly how far their cruelty would go. He needed proof of who these people really were when no one was watching, when they thought they were safe. Aaliyah held the wineglass in trembling hands, the crystal catching the light from the chandeliers above. Thank you all for this opportunity, she began, her voice so quiet people had to strain to hear. Diane cut her off immediately. Louder. We can't hear you back here. Some of us paid $20,000 per plate for this event. The least you can do is project. Aaliyah tried again, forcing volume into her voice even as it shook. Thank you for this opportunity to be here tonight, to learn from all of you, to see what's possible when you work hard and believe in yourself. Diane snatched the glass back before Aaliyah could finish. You know what? Never mind. This is painful to watch. She stepped closer, her perfume expensive and overwhelming. You don't belong here, Aaliyah. You'll never belong here. You can put on a borrowed dress and memorize some pretty words, but everyone in this room can see exactly what you are. A charity case, a sob story, someone who exists, so people like us can feel good about ourselves for caring about the less fortunate. Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears. Please, I just want to leave. I'll go. I'm sorry for everything. Diane lifted the wineglass high, and for one frozen moment, Aaliyah saw what was about to happen. She saw it in Diane's eyes, in the cruel curve of her smile, in the way her friends had gone silent with anticipation. Time stretched out like taffy. The orchestra played on, oblivious. Waiters moved between tables, and then Diane tipped the glass forward and poured the entire contents directly onto Aaliyah's head. Red wine soaked through her hair, ran down her face, stained the borrowed navy dress that Aaliyah would now have to replace with money she didn't have. The liquid was cold and shocking and utterly humiliating. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Someone dropped a fork. A woman's voice said, "Oh my God." But Diane just stood there smiling, satisfied, like she'd accomplished something important. This is what happens, she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, when trash tries to sit with royalty. Aaliyah stood frozen, wine dripping from her hair, onto her shoulders, onto the floor, creating a small pool of red at her feet. Her vision blurred, whether from tears or wine, she couldn't tell. Why? She whispered, the word barely audible. Why would you do this? Diane shrugged. Because you needed to learn your place. Consider it a free lesson in how the real world works. The room's reaction was a mix of horror and cowardice. Some guests looked away, ashamed but unwilling to intervene. Others pulled out their phones, recording the moment, already thinking about the social media value of this spectacle. A few whispered to each other, shaking their heads, but no one stood up. No one told Diane to stop. No one offered Aaliyah a napkin or an apology or even basic human decency. Lenora Hartwell watched her granddaughter's cruelty with something that looked almost like approval in her eyes. Security guards moved forward, assuming their job was to escort the wine-soaked girl out of the building before she could cause more disruption. Aaliyah's voice broke completely. I'm leaving right now." She turned toward the exit, her borrowed shoes squelching in the wine pooled on the marble floor. Her vision blurred with tears and humiliation and the complete collapse of every hope she'd carried into this room. The entire ballroom watched her walk of shame. 200 witnesses to her destruction. 200 people who would go home tonight and maybe mention the incident to their spouses, maybe feel briefly uncomfortable, but who would ultimately forget her name by morning. And that's when the old man in the corner finally stood. His movement was slow and deliberate, each motion carrying the weight of decades and purpose. The sound of his chair scraping against marble cut through the ambient noise. Conversations died mid-sentence as people noticed him. His footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. Click, click, click. Each step measured, unhurried, inevitable. Diane turned, annoyed by the interruption of her triumph. "Can someone please help that old man find his seat?" "He seems confused." But then she saw his face in the light. Really saw it. And her expression changed. The confidence drained away, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition, though that was impossible. Lenora Hartwell had gone completely white. Her wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound sharp and final. Her voice came out as a whisper, barely audible but filled with absolute terror. "No, no, you're dead. You're supposed to be dead." The old man stopped in the center of the ballroom, exactly halfway between Aaliyah and the Hartwell table. He stood there in silence for a long moment, letting the tension build, letting every eye in the room focus on him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of that vast space with perfect clarity. "Hello, Lenora. It's been a long time." Lenora's legs seemed to give out. She grabbed the edge of the table for support, her carefully constructed composure shattering like the wine glass at her feet. "You died," she said again, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "The plane crash, 1995. They found wreckage. They found your briefcase." The old man's expression didn't change. "They found what you wanted them to find, what you paid very good money to make sure they'd find. But I'm afraid I'm very much alive, Lenora. And I've been watching, waiting, making absolutely certain I had every piece of evidence I needed before I came home." He turned to address the entire room, his voice steady and commanding despite his age. "My name is Thaddeus Belmont. Some of you may remember that name. Some of you are probably too young. But 30 years ago, I owned the largest black-owned shipping company in the South. I had real estate holdings across 6 states, investments in technology companies that would eventually become household names. I was, by most measures, one of the wealthiest black men in America." The room was dead silent. Aaliyah had stopped walking toward the exit. She stood frozen, wine still dripping from her hair, her eyes fixed on this stranger who somehow knew Lenora Hartwell's darkest secrets. Diane's face had gone pale. "And I had a daughter," Thaddeus continued. "Her name was Charlotte Belmont. Beautiful, brilliant, compassionate beyond measure. She became a nurse, not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to help people, because she believed service was more valuable than wealth." Thaddeus reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, held it up for the room to see. A young black woman with a bright smile and kind eyes wearing nurse's scrubs. Charlotte fell in love with a wonderful man named Robert Monroe. They had a daughter together. They named her Aaliyah. He turned slowly, his gaze finding Aaliyah across the ballroom, wine-soaked and trembling. Every eye followed his gesture. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. "My mother," she whispered. Her name was Charlotte, but she never said anything about... Thaddeus's eyes glistened. Because she didn't know. Because 30 years ago, Lenora Hartwell convinced my daughter that I had abandoned her, that I wanted nothing to do with her or her choices, that I'd cut her off completely. Charlotte left, heartbroken, believing her father had rejected her. She took her husband's name. She disappeared into a life of service and struggle. And she died 6 months ago, believing until her last breath that her father had never loved her. The grief in his voice was raw and devastating. Aaliyah's knees buckled. A nearby guest caught her arm, helped her stay standing. "Lenora," Thaddeus said, turning back to face the woman who had stolen everything. "When I had my stroke in Europe, when I was hospitalized and fighting for my life, you saw an opportunity, didn't you? You told everyone I'd died. You forged documents. You transferred my assets into your name. You built an empire on my daughter's stolen inheritance. And you convinced Charlotte that I'd never wanted her in the first place." Thaddeus reached down and lifted a leather briefcase that had been sitting beside his chair. He walked to the nearest table, set it down with a heavy thud, and opened it with a precise click. Inside were stacks of documents, photographs, legal certificates, each one meticulously organized. He pulled out the first document, a property deed stamped with official seals. "The deed to Belmont Estate," he announced, holding it up for everyone to see. "Registered to Aaliyah Monroe Belmont, my granddaughter, the legal owner of the property you're currently standing in." Diane's voice came out strangled. "That's impossible. My grandmother owns this estate. We've lived here for 20 years. Thaddeus looked at her with something almost like pity. "Your grandmother owns nothing. She never did. Everything you think belongs to you. Every trust fund, every property, every dollar in every account bearing the Hartwell name. It was all stolen from my daughter, from Charlotte, and now it belongs to Charlotte's heir." He pulled out more documents, spreading them across the table like evidence at a trial. Bank statements showing systematic transfers that Lenora had made over 3 decades. Forged death certificates claiming Thaddeus had died in a plane crash. Property transfers dated suspiciously close to his supposed death. Email correspondence between Lenora and lawyers, carefully coaching them on how to hide assets, how to seal records, how to make sure no one ever questioned the legitimacy of her claims. Aaliyah moved closer, drawn by a force she couldn't name, wine still dripping from her hair but forgotten now. Thaddeus pulled out another photograph, this one showing a young Lenora and a younger version of himself, standing together outside a building with a sign that read Belmont Shipping. "You were my business partner, Lenora," Thaddeus said quietly. "When I started my company, you helped me navigate the legal complexities. I trusted you with everything. Power of attorney, access to accounts. You were like family. When I had my stroke in Brussels, when I was fighting to recover in a European hospital, unable to communicate, you didn't wait to see if I'd survive. You saw an opportunity to take everything I'd built, and you took it." Lenora finally found her voice, though it shook. "You were gone for 2 years. 2 years with no word, no contact. I kept the business alive. I maintained everything. Someone had to make decisions." Thaddeus's expression hardened. "You made decisions, all right. You decided to declare me legally dead. You decided to forge my signature on documents transferring assets to yourself. You decided to tell my daughter that I'd disowned her, that I wanted nothing to do with her chosen life. You poisoned her against me, Lenora. You stole her father and her inheritance in one calculated move. And when I finally recovered, when I finally made it back to America, Charlotte was already gone, living under her husband's name, unreachable, believing I'd abandoned her." Aaliyah's voice was barely a whisper. "She worked herself to death. 3 jobs, no insurance. When her kidneys failed, we couldn't afford dialysis. We lost our apartment. I've been living in a shelter since she died. Thaddeus closed his eyes briefly, pain etched across his face. I know, child. I've known about you for 3 months. When I finally recovered enough to hire investigators, when I started searching for Charlotte, I learned she'd passed. But the investigators found you, living in that shelter, working double shifts, studying for your future. I've been watching over you ever since, making sure you were safe, making sure these legal documents were absolutely airtight before I revealed myself. Because I knew, he turned to glare at Lenora, that this woman would fight with every resource she'd stolen to keep what wasn't hers. At that moment, a team of lawyers entered through the side door, each carrying briefcases and file folders. They moved with practiced efficiency, spreading additional documents across multiple tables. One of them, a distinguished black woman in her 50s, stepped forward. My name is Patricia Winters. I represent the Belmont estate. DNA tests confirm that Aaliyah Monroe is the biological daughter of Charlotte Belmont, who was the sole heir of Thaddeus Belmont. Every asset currently held under the Hartwell name was obtained through fraudulent means. We have documentation of forged signatures, illegal property transfers, and systematic embezzlement spanning 3 decades. Diane grabbed for the documents, her hands shaking. This is all fake. You can't just show up with some papers and claim everything belongs to her. Another lawyer spoke up, his voice calm and clinical. Miss Hartwell, I understand this is shocking, but these documents have been verified by 3 independent law firms. The DNA evidence is conclusive. The forensic accountants have traced every fraudulent transaction. Your grandmother's claims to the Belmont fortune have no legal standing whatsoever. Lenora's carefully constructed mask was cracking now, revealing the desperation underneath. I built this legacy. I grew the investments. I maintained the properties. The business was failing when Thaddeus disappeared. I saved everything. Thaddeus's voice cut through her protests like a knife. With my money, Lenora, my name, my daughter's inheritance, Charlotte had every right to walk away from wealth and choose service. That was her decision to make. This fortune was always meant to be hers, to accept or refuse as she saw fit. You took that choice away from her. You let her die in poverty while living in luxury built on her stolen birthright. He pulled out one final photograph, and this one made Lenora flinch visibly. It showed a much younger Lenora and Thaddeus smiling at a celebration, his arm around her shoulders like family. You were more than a business partner, he said quietly. I considered you a friend, almost a sister. I trusted you with everything, and you betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. You didn't just steal money, you stole my daughter. And now she's dead because she couldn't afford the medical care that her own inheritance could have easily provided. The weight of that statement settled over the ballroom like a physical presence. Diane backed away from the table, her face ashen. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear I didn't know any of this. My grandmother told me the business was ours, that we'd built it ourselves, that we came from generations of success. I never questioned it. I never thought to ask. Thaddeus looked at her and his expression softened slightly. Ignorance doesn't erase cruelty, Miss Hartwell. You poured wine on a girl's head because you believed you were better than her. You humiliated her in front of 200 people because you thought your money made you superior. The money was never yours. The superiority was always an illusion. But the cruelty, that was all you. Diane's eyes went to Aaliyah, still standing there in her wine-stained dress, and the full reality seemed to crash over her like a wave. She'd just assaulted the actual owner of the estate. She'd publicly humiliated a billionaire heiress. She'd poured wine on the head of the girl who legally owned every stick of furniture, every piece of art, every trust fund that bore her name. The social media posts were probably already going viral. Her reputation, her engagement, her entire carefully constructed life was collapsing in real time. Thaddeus turned to the security guards who'd been moving to escort Aaliyah out earlier. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "please remove Lenora and Diane Hartwell from this property. They are trespassing." The guards hesitated, looking confused. One of them said, "Sir, with all due respect, the Hartwells own this estate." Thaddeus gestured to the lawyers. "Show them the documentation." Patricia Winters stepped forward with the property deed. "This estate is legally owned by Aaliyah Monroe Belmont. The Hartwell claims were based on fraudulent documents. We have court orders authorizing their immediate removal." The security guards approached Lenora and Diane slowly, still processing what they were being told. Lenora straightened her spine, trying to summon the authority she'd wielded for 3 decades. "You cannot do this. I have rights. I will fight this in every court in the country. I will spend whatever it takes to prove that these documents are fabricated." Patricia Winters pulled out another folder. "The criminal charges have already been filed with the Charleston County District Attorney's Office. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and identity theft. Detectives are waiting outside to escort you for questioning. We thought it would be less disruptive to handle your removal from the premises first, but they're prepared to arrest you right here if necessary." Diane grabbed her grandmother's arm, her voice rising to a panicked pitch. "Criminal charges? Grandmother, what is she talking about?" "What did you do?" Lenora's composure finally shattered completely. She turned on Diane with sudden viciousness. "What did I do? I survived. I built something when the world tried to tear us down. I made us matter." The foundation director, who'd earlier congratulated Aaliyah on her scholarship, now approached Thaddeus with visible distress. "Mr. Belmont, I had absolutely no idea about any of this. If I'd known that Aaliyah was your granddaughter, that she was the rightful heir, I would never have seated her at the back. I'm deeply sorry for any discomfort she experienced." Thaddeus's voice was gentle but firm. "She shouldn't have needed to be my granddaughter to be treated with basic human dignity. She came here as a scholarship recipient, a young woman who'd earned recognition through merit, and your guests treated her like she was contaminated. That says something about your foundation, doesn't it?" The director had no response to that. Around the ballroom, guests who'd watched Aaliyah's humiliation were now looking at their phones, at the documents the lawyers had spread across the tables, at the girl still standing in her wine-stained dress, who'd just become one of the wealthiest young black women in the country. The social calculus was shifting in real time. People who'd laughed at Diane's cruelty were now edging away from the Hartwells, creating physical distance that demonstrated where their loyalties would land now that the power structure had inverted. 2 detectives entered through the main doors, their badges visible. Lenora Hartwell, the older one, said, "We need you to come with us for questioning regarding fraudulent financial activities spanning from 1995 to the present." Lenora drew herself up, trying to maintain dignity even as everything collapsed around her. "I built this city's Black Business Coalition. I funded scholarships for hundreds of students. I created opportunities for our community when no one else would." The detective's voice was not unkind, but was completely unmoved. "You built those things with stolen money, ma'am. That doesn't erase the good you did, but it doesn't excuse the crimes either." As the detectives moved to escort her out, Lenora turned to Aaliyah one final time. Her voice was sharp with desperate venom. "You think you can handle this? You're just a child who's been living in a shelter. This world will eat you alive. The business deals, the social obligations, the pressure. You'll lose everything within a year. You don't have the education, the breeding, the experience to manage this kind of wealth." Thaddeus stepped between them before Aaliyah could respond. "She won't be alone. She has me. And unlike you, Lenora, I'll teach her what this wealth is actually for. Not status, not superiority, service, legacy, making sure no other child has to watch their parent die because they can't afford medical care. Lenora was escorted out, still protesting, still insisting she'd done nothing wrong, that she'd built everything herself, that the world would see she was the victim of this elaborate conspiracy. Diane followed head down, no longer meeting anyone's eyes, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The ballroom doors closed behind them with a heavy finality. For a long moment, no one moved. The orchestra had stopped playing minutes ago. Waiters stood frozen with trays in their hands. 200 guests stared at Aaliyah Monroe Belmont like they were seeing her for the first time. She stood there in her ruined dress, wine drying in her hair, her entire world having shifted on its axis so violently she could barely process what had just happened. Thaddeus approached her slowly, giving her space to process, to react, to feel whatever she needed to feel. He stopped a few feet away and spoke quietly. I know this is overwhelming. You don't have to make any decisions tonight. You don't have to speak to anyone. If you want to leave right now, we can arrange that. Aaliyah's voice came out shaky. Is it real? All of this? The documents, the estate, is it actually real? Thaddeus nodded. Every word. You are Charlotte Belmont's daughter. You are my granddaughter. And you are the legal heir to everything your mother should have inherited 30 years ago. Tears started falling then, mixing with the wine residue on her face, and these tears were different from the earlier ones. These carried grief and relief and overwhelming confusion and something that might have been hope. My mother, Aaliyah whispered. She died thinking she had no family, thinking she was alone, thinking her father had rejected her. Thaddeus's own eyes filled with tears. That is my greatest regret. I was searching for her, but I was too slow. The stroke damaged my memory for a time. By the time I pieced everything together, by the time I found where she'd gone, she was already gone. I found you 3 months after she passed. I've spent every single day since then, making sure you'd never struggle like that again, making sure the legal case was absolutely airtight, making sure that when I revealed myself, no one could ever take this away from you. Guests began approaching tentatively, their earlier judgment replaced with carefully calculated deference. The foundation director spoke first. Miss Monroe Belmont, I cannot adequately express how sorry I am for the treatment you received tonight. If there's anything the foundation can do to make amends. Aaliyah cut him off, her voice stronger now despite the tears. It's Monroe, Aaliyah Monroe. That's the name my mother gave me. That's who she raised me to be. Thaddeus smiled through his own tears. Monroe Belmont, perhaps. Honor them both, your mother's choice and your bloodline. Aaliyah considered this, then nodded slowly. Monroe Belmont. Yes, that feels right. More guests approached, offering condolences and apologies, suddenly remembering that they'd always thought the Hartwells were suspicious, that they'd never quite trusted Lenora's story, that they'd wanted to defend Aaliyah but weren't sure how to intervene. The revisionist history was already beginning. One woman who'd been sitting near Diane's table stepped forward, her voice genuine. I need to be honest. I watched what happened to you and I said nothing. I was ashamed to speak up. I prioritized social comfort over basic decency. That was wrong and I'm sorry. Aaliyah looked at this woman, saw real remorse in her eyes and managed a small nod. Thank you for saying that. The waiter who'd earlier brought Aaliyah water approached nervously. Miss Monroe Belmont, I just wanted to say your mother sounds like she was an incredible person. Aaliyah's face softened. She was. She really was. Thank you. Thaddeus pulled out his wallet and handed the waiter a business card. Come see me Monday morning. I'm restructuring several companies and I need people in management who understand what it means to treat others with dignity. The waiter's eyes widened. Sir, I'm just a waiter. I don't have management experience. Thaddeus smiled. You have character. You showed kindness when no one else would. The skills can be taught. The character is either there or it isn't. The crowd was beginning to thin as guests realized the evening was effectively over. Thaddeus gently guided Aaliyah toward a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the remaining onlookers. I know this is overwhelming, he said quietly. You don't have to understand everything tonight. You don't have to become someone new. You're already exactly who you need to be. Aaliyah looked down at her wine-stained dress. I don't know how to be this. A Belmont, someone who owns estates and has billions of dollars. I've been trying to figure out how to afford textbooks. Thaddeus's voice was warm. You already know how to be what matters most. Charlotte's daughter. She taught you resilience, compassion, the value of hard work, the importance of service. That's the foundation. The money, the properties, those are just tools. What matters is what you do with them. Aaliyah's fear broke through. What if Lenora was right? What if I lose everything? What if I make terrible decisions and destroy it all? Thaddeus reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. Then we'll rebuild. But you won't lose it. I'll teach you everything I know about business, investments, legacy planning. But more importantly, I'll teach you what your mother already understood. Wealth without purpose is just numbers on paper. It's what you do with it that matters. It's who you help, who you lift up, what you build that outlasts you. Aaliyah was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said something that made Thaddeus's heart swell with pride. The scholarship. I still want to go to college. I know I can go anywhere now, fancy schools with my name on buildings, but I earned that heritage scholarship. My mother believed in education. I won't abandon that dream just because everything else changed. Thaddeus smiled. Then you'll go. You'll study whatever makes your heart sing, and I'll be at your graduation, something I never got to do for Charlotte. That's a promise. Aaliyah looked around the ballroom, at the crystal chandeliers and marble floors and evidence of obscene wealth. This estate, can we turn it into something meaningful? What are you thinking? Thaddeus asked. A foundation, Aaliyah said, her voice growing stronger. For families who lose parents, for kids who need support, scholarship money, housing assistance, grief counseling, medical care for people who can't afford treatment. My mother spent her life caring for people who were dying. Let's honor that. Let's make sure no other child has to watch their parent die because they don't have enough money. Thaddeus's eyes filled with tears again. Charlotte would be so incredibly proud of you. We'll start immediately. I'll connect you with the best foundation administrators, the smartest strategists, people who can help you build something that lasts. Aaliyah's vision expanded as she spoke. And I want to hire people who've been overlooked, people like me, people who got told they don't belong, people who know what struggle looks like. Give them opportunities that change their lives. Thaddeus nodded enthusiastically. Yes, exactly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that will make this fortune mean something. Aaliyah looked down at her ruined dress one more time, at the wine stains that had humiliated her so thoroughly an hour ago. She touched the fabric thoughtfully. You know what? I think I'm going to keep this dress. Frame it, maybe, as a reminder of where I started tonight, of what I overcame. Thaddeus laughed, surprised and delighted. That's perfect. That's exactly the kind of perspective that will keep you grounded. Never forget where you came from, even as you step into where you're going. He offered his arm. Shall we go home, granddaughter? Aaliyah took his arm, still processing the word home. Where is home? Tonight, right here, this estate that's legally yours. Tomorrow, we'll figure it out together. I have a house in Atlanta, a place in New York. You can choose where you want to be while you finish your education, or we can find somewhere entirely new. The world just opened up for you. They walked through the ballroom together, past the table where she'd been humiliated, past the spot where wine had been poured on her head, past all the guests who were now watching her with new eyes. She walked out the front doors not as a charity case or a scholarship recipient, but as Aaliyah Monroe Belmont, owner of everything she surveyed. 6 months later, Aaliyah stood in front of a different building, this one newly constructed in North Charleston. A banner across the entrance read, "Charlotte Monroe Memorial Foundation." News cameras had gathered to cover the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Aaliyah wore a professional pantsuit, her hair styled, her bearing confident. Thaddeus stood beside her, beaming with grandfatherly pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," Aaliyah addressed the crowd, her voice clear and strong. "This foundation exists because my mother, Charlotte Monroe, spent her entire life caring for people in their final days. She gave them dignity when everything else had been stripped away. She believed that every person, regardless of their bank account, deserved compassion and quality care. She lived that belief every single day until kidney failure took her from me 6 months ago." Aaliyah's voice caught slightly, but she pushed through. "She died because we couldn't afford the treatment that might have saved her life. That is unacceptable. That cannot be allowed to continue happening to families in this city, in this state, in this country. This foundation will provide medical care assistance, grief counseling, housing support, and educational scholarships to families dealing with terminal illness or the loss of a parent. Because no child should have to make the choices I made. No family should have to choose between rent and treatment." She cut the ribbon to enthusiastic applause. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Thaddeus hugged her tightly. "Your mother is watching," he whispered, "and she is so, so proud." That evening, a different kind of news story made the local papers. The headlines read, "Hartwell Matriarch sentenced to 15 years for fraud and embezzlement." A smaller article below it noted that Diane Hartwell had been stripped of all assets and was working retail at a department store to support herself while her former fiancé had publicly ended their engagement. Aaliyah read the articles in her new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a nice but not ostentatious building near her college campus. She'd refused to live in the mansion, said it felt too big, too empty. She wanted to earn her degree like any other student. Thaddeus had supported her decision completely. She felt no satisfaction reading about Diane's downfall, just a deep, complicated sadness. Justice isn't always sweet, Thaddeus had told her when the sentencing came through, but it's necessary. The world has to know that stealing someone's inheritance, that building wealth on lies and fraud, carries consequences. The following Saturday, Aaliyah visited her mother's grave. The headstone had been replaced with beautiful granite that read, "Charlotte Monroe Belmont, beloved mother, compassionate healer, forever remembered." Fresh flowers adorned the grave. Aaliyah sat down on the grass beside it. "I found him, Mama," she said quietly. "I found Grandpa. And everything you believed about him was a lie. He never abandoned you. He never stopped loving you. Lenora Hartwell stole everything from both of you and then convinced you that you were alone in the world." She traced her fingers over her mother's name on the headstone. "The scholarship you worked so hard to help me earn? It's just the beginning. I'm going to help so many families, Mama, in your name. I'm going to make sure parents get the care they need, that kids don't have to watch the people they love die because money stands between them and treatment. I'm going to use this fortune the way you would have wanted, not for status or power or proving I'm better than anyone, but for service, for compassion, for making the world a little less cruel." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees. Aaliyah sat there for a long time, feeling her mother's presence, feeling the weight of legacy and loss and possibility. When she finally stood to leave, she felt lighter, like she'd been carrying something heavy and had finally been given permission to set it down. The narrator's voice returned one final time, offering wisdom earned through suffering and transformation. They tried to humiliate her into silence, to teach her that her place was at the back table in the shadows, accepting whatever scraps the powerful decided to throw her way. But her place was never at the back table. Her place was at the head of it, not because of wealth, though that came, but because of worth, because of resilience, because every person carries value that has nothing to do with their bank account or their last name or who their family is. Every person has a story. Every struggle matters. Don't let anyone pour wine on your dreams and call it a lesson in reality. Don't let cruelty masquerade as teaching you your place. Stand up. Speak your truth. Know your value. And when you find yourself with power, with resources, with the ability to change lives, remember what it felt like when you had nothing. Remember who showed you kindness when you were at your lowest. Remember that dignity is not something people earn through wealth or breeding or status. It's something every human being deserves simply by virtue of being human. Aaliyah Monroe Belmont learned that lesson in a ballroom in Charleston, South Carolina, with wine dripping down her face and 200 people watching her humiliation. She learned it not through the cruelty itself, but through her response to it, through choosing service over revenge, through building something meaningful from ashes, through honoring her mother's memory not with bitterness but with purpose. Her legacy wouldn't be measured in the billions she inherited. It would be measured in the families she helped, the lives she saved, the children who grew up knowing that losing a parent doesn't mean losing hope. That wealth, real wealth, isn't about what you own. It's about what you give, what you build, who you become when the world tries to break you and you choose instead to rise. If this story moved you, how would you honor a parent who sacrificed everything for your future? Share this video with someone who needs to remember that their value isn't determined by how others treat them. Your worth is inherent. Your story matters. The world needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next one.